Good morning, chess friends. In this video, I'm going to explain how you can make your opponents blunder. I'm going to do that based on games from the FIDE Grand Swiss 2025. These are Grandmaster games, but after every game, I will explain how that applies to your game as a club player. So we start with the first game between FIDE and Henriques Villagra. White is in check and decides to get out of check by moving away, king g2. And now black makes a blunder, bishop takes b2. So let's see why this is a blunder and how the game continued. So white took, black took back, g6 was a vulnerability, and now probably black was counting on queen takes g6. But the game continued, a takes b4, rook d8, threatening a discovered attack on the queen with knight f4. But after bishop takes a4, knight f4, allowing the discovered attack, black resigned. So what is the root cause of this, you could say, blunder? So we are here, and bishop takes b2 is a blunder. And the correct move was here b3. Bishop b1, and then you could say the same variation, leading to equality. To start with, of course, there's a lot of tension and complexity in this position. But there are also two other things. The first thing is that I think that the black player underestimated the vulnerability of the b3 to g8 diagonal, right? Because in the end, if we go through this line and see how it ends and why the opponent had to resign, it has to do with the deadly threat of bishop b3 check, right? And then the king has to go to the h-file, and then there's a discovered attack with the bishop on h6. So it's an underestimation of a vulnerability, that's one. It's complexity in the position, that's the major point. And I think there's a third point, if we look at the line, and I said, what do I expect as a black player? I think in this position, right, I think black might have been calculating queen takes g6, queen takes g6, rook takes, bishop takes g6, rook e6 with equality. So in general, right, if we think about the whole situation, it's complex. There's a lot of tension between the pieces. It can lead to a position with, you could say, in this case, right, a material balance that is not like that's not natural, right? And it's like a queen against a rook and a bishop. It's deep in the variation that you have to visualize that bishop b3 is a deadly threat. And I think, so if we look to this position here, right, it would be more natural for many players to take the pawn close to the king because that's where the action is. And that would have led to an equal position. So what did we learn, right? Complexity, tension leads to blunders. Players lose control. Vulnerabilities are often underestimated. And players have a bias for calculating forcing moves. And in this case, the forcing moves occurring on one side of the board. So what does it mean for club players, right? How can you apply this? Select openings that lead to unbalanced position that you understand better than your opponent. Because of course you can say, I have a great difficulty navigating complex positions myself, but you can select openings that are not symmetric and where you, for instance, sacrifice a pawn for space and a lead in development, and then know better than your opponent how to play that opponent position. In general, right, there's a chess advice that says create messy positions when you are in a losing position, right? So messy positions basically means that there is a lot of complexity and it's easy for your opponent to go wrong. And so my advice is, don't wait until you're in a losing position, but create a controlled messy position, right? So you sacrifice a pawn for initiative and for space, but create immediately unbalances and don't wait for you to be lost. Create vulnerabilities in your opponent's position, right? Here we saw that bishop b3 was the deadly threat. So those can be damaging the pawn structure. Weaken the position of the king. Create vulnerable pieces that have only limited activity or can be trapped and that work alone. Create pins. If you think about a pin and you think about your army and the force of your army, a pinned piece has a very limited force. Also, if you have a piece that has a very crucial defending task, which is my favorite vulnerability, that also has very limited force. And often, if you can attack that defending piece, you can win the game because, right, if there's a queen defending a mate near to the king, if you attack the queen, you win the game. And then there's the forcing move bias, right? So you can increase the tension by increasing the activity of your pieces and playing on the whole board, right? So in this case, white took on b4 and then on a4. So it was playing on the queen side, and probably the opponent continued to expect that the white player would take on g6 and continue to play on the king side. So it's a whole board play, increase the tension, create vulnerabilities, and create unbalanced positions. This is the first example. Let's go to the second example. So this is Harry Geisy against Bluebaum. And here, if you see what's going on, Bluebaum plays rook d7, right? So what are the vulnerabilities? We have a bishop on d2, and there's a discovered attack threatened on the queen on d4. So increasing the tension, threatening a discovered attack, and also there's like, say, an indirect attack on the bishop on d2. And now Erigaisi goes wrong with queen a7, and after bishop a8, the piece on d2 gets lost because everywhere where the queen goes, right? Queen d4, knight f6, queen a4, knight b6, queen a6, knight c7. The bishop on d2 is lost. So it's important to accumulate vulnerabilities in the opponent's position. So it's like the position of your opponent will reach a tipping point and then the position will collapse. So when you think about vulnerabilities, right, make them accumulate, and then the opponent will make a mistake, or just the position will collapse because there are too many vulnerabilities. Verusai against Jakub Boev. So this was extremely sharp game, right? So it starts with like a two knights attack, right, with queen b3, and immediately you see what Jakub Boev does. It's like sacrifice in exchange, and you can see here the queen of Verusai gets chased, and it's of course completely crazy position, right, with the knight on e2. And this continues, like, I mean, this, right? I mean, the knight continues to be chased and under attack. Knight gets chased, right? King doesn't find safety, the black king. And after all this craziness, right? Look at this, bishop f3. So much tension, so many combinations possible in this position. threatening mate in 1 with bishop takes g2, rook g1 defending, right? And now Yakuboev goes wrong here by playing rook f8, which is a blunder, and he had to play knight takes g1. So you can see this was such a tense game, and I think if you look to Erigaisi and Ferrucci, they are willing to take risks and accept worse positions deliberately to create positions with great complexity and with a lot of tension where their opponents ultimately can go wrong, right? So in this case, his opponent had a perfectly normal game, but it was so difficult that in the end he made a mistake. And so they are kind of role models for players who deliberately create complex positions, and they are willing to take a risk in the process. So for club players, right, many club players, they are trading pieces and choosing safe moves because they got burned many times if they chose very aggressive continuations. So my advice would be is experiment in your online games with playing more aggressively. And I have this process, orientation, and then calculation, verification, to select moves. So if you have a very complex position and you need to analyze it in more detail, use that process. So start with the orientation, look what changed in the position, what's the intent of the opponent, look at the position characteristics, what's the threat of the opponent, and then find your candidate moves. You calculate, and at the end of each variation, you need an evaluation of the position. You need to visualize how the dynamics of the pieces changed in the variations. And finally, you verify. When you have selected your final candidate move, you ask yourself the question, did I really consider the strongest move of my opponent? So inspiring players, Aragaisi and Ferrucci. This is a game between Gurel and Gukesh. Gukesh, of course, he lost 3 games in a row and was in bad form. And that, of course, played a role. But if you look at this position, right, there's an element that is often underestimated when it comes to the complexity of a position. So white plays here g4, and now Gukesh blunders with bishop takes a3. And what is the complexity? I think is to assess the strength of passed pawns, right? Because we see here that white has 3 passed pawns on the king side, and black has 4 passed pawns on the queen side. So the correct move here was bishop f8, rook takes f8, and then the only move, right? Because this king should not go, let's say, on the c or the d file, because then that weakens the advance of the pawns on c3 and d4. I will not go into detail. So king b7, and then you can see, right? Yeah, I need a very specific calculation to calculate that this in the end leads to a equal position. And in the game, of course, what happened, right? You can see what happens here. You can say, oh, this white pawns have been stopped, and black has 4 pawns on the queen side, but you can see what happens. White activates their bishop, brings it back to f4 from a3, is well cooperating with the opponent's pieces, and now the pawns are going to drop on the queen side of black. So I think the message here for club players is assessing the strength of passed pawns is very difficult. So if you can create them, know that it's very likely that your opponent will blunder because it's hard to assess. And I've been burned many times myself when I had winning positions and my opponents had passed pawns, and I made the wrong assessment in how to deal with them. So we were talking about accumulation of vulnerabilities. So when we look at this position, right, black plays h6, and now white plays the blunder in one move, rook f4, right? So of course there's the vulnerability of the battery of the bishop on b7 and the queen on c6 looking to g2. But you can see in the continuation, right, there's this discovered attack, and now of course white planned for queen f3, and now we see a second vulnerability on the black side, which is the back rank, because after rook takes e2, there's queen c1 checkmate. So I think this is like interesting. So we saw in the first example this idea of bishop b3 on the weakened king, and here we see the, let's say, the weakened back rank, and basically white couldn't afford themselves to play the move rook f4, opening up this diagonal, and basically missed the vulnerability of the back rank. So accumulate vulnerabilities and the position of your opponent will collapse. So this is a game between Geary and Jordan van Foreest. And I start a little bit earlier because, so we see here, right? It's like white has the bishop pair, Geary, and black has a knight and a bishop. And you would say it's not a very complex position, but you know that the bishop pair is stronger in the endgame. So there is pressure on the black position. And after king f2, f6, f4, both players had 24 minutes on move 28. And then, of course, you also get the increment. So you would say it's reasonably comfortable. But now look what happens. Jordan spent 9 minutes on knight e6. And I mean, if you look to other moves like king f7, they were all equally good. So it was not like a critical move. But you can see that if you play it against this bishop pair, it's like finding the right plan to equalize and keep the position equal is not easy. So he spent 9 minutes here. Okay, Geary trades. Bishop e2 attacks the pawn on e5. Knight d4. Now bishop f1. And now, right, 9 minutes for knight e6, and now 10 minutes for bishop takes f1. And in the meantime, black is in time trouble. So, I mean, he had still here on move 32, like 3.5 minutes. Of course, the major threat here is bishop takes d4. And so he had like for 8 minutes, 8 moves, like 3.5 minutes left plus the increment. And here he makes the final mistake by playing knight c2 with 15 seconds left. So what does this teach us? All right. So when there's complexity and tension in the position, and you keep your opponent under constant pressure, that leads to time pressure. And it takes time to find the best move to maintain the balance in time pressure, right? I make an estimate, we play 400 to 700 rating points worse, right? So if you think about knowing your openings really well, right, you probably gain between 100 and 200 rating points. But if you're in time pressure, right, your performance will go down like 400 to 700 points. So this is a strategy, of course, like constant pressure, keeping the pressure on your opponent, and then they have difficulty finding moves, and then finally they make a mistake in time pressure because they are going to play so much worse than they otherwise would. The second thing that is the first example here is that equal endgames are not a draw, right? So you can continue to play if you, right, if you have a position like this, it can be equal, you just continue to play. And then far into the game, your opponents can make mistakes, blunder. And it's like, I was surprised, right? So this is like two bishops against a knight and a bishop. But you can see here, this is a game between Vincent Keimer and FIDE. Here, FIDE played c6, and Keimer said, I couldn't believe it, right? That someone would give up this reserve move. And I immediately knew that the position of white was lost. So equal endgame, right? With perfect play a draw, but practically speaking, pawn endings, rook endings, all endgames, they have chances if you. So it is worth for a club player, and I think a club player should focus on pawn endings, on rook endgames, general principles, and then practice their calculation and visualization in endgames. I think they're very ideal for practicing those skills, because the decision trees are not very wide, but pretty deep. And but in this case, right? I mean, Keimer said, okay, I have g3, g4, so black should never play c6 and give up this reserve move. But the line itself, right? If you think about what could have happened, I think if you were, because he spent like 30 minutes on this move c6, right? So this was like a possible continuation. And if you think what happens, right? So white promotes with check. The king is on b3. The pawn has not promoted yet, but this is a draw. So it is also, right? I mean, if you think about it, this is in total, right? We were on move 43, and this is move 52. So let's say roughly 18 ply. So a lot of visualization, and then you have to evaluate and say, is this actually a draw, yes or no? So it's pretty deep. But Keimer, I mean, he was convinced that after c6 he was winning, and this is the only winning move, right? So you can see, and now he's going to use his two tempi and get to an easy win. Yes, so equal endgames are not a draw. Know your pawn endings and your rook endgames, and then some general principles, and continue to play them because you can gain a lot of points in the endgame. And I know a lot of club players that I never get to the endgame. Well, if I look to my students, they many times get endgames and they win their pawn endings many times because they know them better, relatively speaking, than their opponents. So this is Shankland against Ferrugia. Same, right? This is a pawn ending. Lost, right? So you can see, again, right, you could say, oh, and a grandmaster, right, at 2700 level should be able to calculate the pawn ending, right? But it's kind of also here tricky. The principle, of course, of shielding of the king makes sense, but you would be, of course, very concerned that this is actually a draw. But there's a specific strategy. I call it tit for tat. You go after my pawn, I go after your pawn, tit for tat. And this ends in a draw because both promote at the same time. Yes, but you can see here, again, a pawn ending. We had it with Keimer against FIDE, and here we have it against Shankland against Ferrugia. And Shankland just loses an equal pawn ending. So they're worth knowing, and you can see here, concrete calculation and visualization is very important, because at a certain moment you have principles, but you also have to be able to calculate and visualize how it can continue and find the critical line. So let's go to this position. This is from Divya Desmuk, who played in the open section, and she did extremely well, made a draw against Gukesh, won against several grandmasters. But, of course, right, so what happened here? Bishop c7 was played by the opponent, Shugurov. 26-27. And for a Divya, you can imagine this is an 11-round tournament. Every round she gets challenged because she's one of the lowest rated players. And every grandmaster she plays makes it into a long game to tire her. And then in the end, right, if you have an 11-round tournament, you're just too tired. So when you think about complex positions, long games, right, you can get into time pressure or you can get very tired. And when you're tired, I think also you play worse by about 400 to 700 elo points. So constant pressure, long games, long tournament, tiredness sets in. If you look to Tata Steel tournament in the Netherlands, 13 rounds, not 11 rounds. And many times there were, so my daughter, she played in the Grandmaster Group C. And of course, Jeroen van den Berg, he warns the female players that this is a very long tournament. And if you're one of the lower rated players, this is what will happen. Every opponent will play as long as possible to see if they can force a mistake. And then the tournament becomes really long and really tiring, and it's very hard to keep it up for 13 rounds. So in this position, she played bishop b2, and after bishop b6, she could resign. And of course, right, this is not her level at all, but this is just an accumulation of tiredness throughout the tournament. And the same here for Rothstein against Hare Krishna, right? So the opponent played in this position g5. And now, of course, the pawn on e4 is hanging under attack by the rook on e8 and the bishop on h7. f3 was played, and after bishop f5, right? Pinned piece is a poor defender. Bishop takes h3 is following, and then the bishop on f1 is lost. White had to resign. This was the 11th round. So, I mean, right? It's not that the player has to do tactics to avoid this. No, this is just, it's only to do with being tired. And this is the typical last round game. But you know, right? If you don't make a draw and you continue to play, then you have the chance that your opponent gets tired and makes a mistake and plays much worse than their normal level. I just wanted to show this position. This is like the other side of, you could say, um, yeah, you could say blundering. So in this case, this is between Keimer and Bluebaum. So Bluebaum is lost here, plays king e6. And now Keimer makes the blunder, rook h7, after which it is a draw after knight takes g3. And I think what my takeaway is, of course, of this game, right? When you look at, I mean, it's like devastating, right? If you look to Keimer, he has his sponsors, he has Peter Leko as his trainer. You can see that he worked on his physical condition. He lost a lot of weight. So everything, he had perfect preparation. He gets the winning position. And then basically he throws it away with one move, which is rook h7. All that preparation, because in this position, and this was in round 10, this leads to a drawn position, right? I mean, f and h versus the rook is already a draw, but here black even has an extra pawn, so no chance. But I think there's also another point, right? I mean, this was devastating from Vincent Keimer perspective, but I think we have to praise Matthias Bluebaum for his resilience, right? I mean, so the other thing is like, you can make your opponents blunder by being very resilient. And he was not giving up and continued to pose his questions to his opponent. And you can see here there's an opponent 2751. Of course, it's late in the tournament, but it paid off. So on club player level, many times you get a second chance. By putting up resistance and being resilient, you can increase the chances of getting a second chance. And you can say your opponent blunders because he doesn't convert a winning position, but you also create that blunder by challenging your opponent to continue to find the best moves. Devastating, but also a compliment at the same time to Matthias Bluebaum to continue to fight. I just wanted to show two positions because you say, okay, right, club players, they trade pieces, they look for forcing moves, but you can see that actually also grandmasters do it. So this is from the article, Bridging the Human AI Knowledge Gap Through Concept Discovery and Transfer in AlphaZero. And my daughter was first author, and then she discovered unique concepts in the play of AlphaZero and was able to teach them to Gukesh and MVL and Fan and Kramnik. So there was also knowledge transfer. And this was one of the positions. And this highlights, I think it's kind of interesting. So the grandmasters, right? They would go for something like this. And then, right, it's like a bit stale. I mean, it's like a block position. And right, it's like they think that the action is on the king side. And if you see, right, one of the variations that AlphaZero was looking at was to play queen d2, right? So this prevents knight e4. And the grandmaster commented, queen d2 is a useful move as it stops knight e4 and protects f4 and can be better placed in case of b4 in the future. So this was one of the lines, right? So after queen d2, rook h7, h5. So rook h3. And now AlphaZero sacrifices a pawn and plays rook f1. And now you see what the intent is, if you go further into the line, is to play king b2, a3, b4, right? So you see that, first of all, grandmasters have a bias for forcing moves. You see that like a 3600 engine is willing to give up material, plays over the whole board, and the grandmasters also, they want to keep control over the position. They're more materialistic, and it's very difficult to evaluate the value of temporary activity and a space advantage. And grandmasters, they also, just like amateurs, look for some kind of consistency in plan. So in this case, right, they thought that, okay, right, I have to create a breakthrough on the king side. And that's where they were focused on. It was not like this, you have this principle of two weaknesses, but this is like the principle of two plans, right? I have this breakthrough on the king side, but I can also advance my pawns on the other side with king b2, a3, b4. And first I have a prophylactic move, queen d2, taking away some counterplay of the opponent. This is one. And this is another one, right? So in this position, it's white to move. Grandmasters, they want to make rook takes h5 work. So they're looking for forcing moves. They have a bias, just like we all do. It's not only amateurs who like forcing moves. No, and like we are being taught that look for forcing moves, right? And why is that the case? Because of our computational capabilities. We have limited computational capabilities. And that's the easiest for us to evaluate, and it's like low-hanging fruit. If it works, then we don't have to think about activity. So grandmasters, they try to make this work, right? But you can see black wants to trade pieces, and if they want to avoid, right, then basically there's no continuation for white to further attack the king. Black is safe. But now if you look at how alpha zero continues, alpha zero just right. I mean, you have all this accumulation of power close to the black king, shifts play to the other side and starts attacking the vulnerabilities, right? The c6 pawn, the a5 pawn, and then still the king, right? So it's like just increasing the activity, slowly attacking the vulnerabilities, gaining more space, and getting to a much better position. Total board play, right? And not looking for forcing moves. And building, like say, accumulating the vulnerabilities on the opponent's side. And in the end, there's kind of a tipping point that leads to a winning position. So what does it mean for you? Create complexity, create tension, many pieces attacking each other, weakened king, unbalances. Consequences, your opponent has to defend, has to find only move, gets in time pressure, plays worse by 400 to 700 moves, gets tired, plays worse by 4 to 700 elo points. Then create multiple vulnerabilities, right? They lead to threats, lead to tipping points. We saw that equal endgames are actually not a draw, right? So continue to play. Realize there is a bias for forcing moves because that's what we find easy to compute. But if I would go to the Stockfish collective and would ask them, can you design for me an engine that starts with looking at forcing moves? They would tell me, boom or go away. That's what we did 30 years ago, right? Then they were materialistic and they would be looking at forcing moves. But you can see with the current computational power and the neural networks that engines actually have become masters in increasing activity and leveraging the advantages of more space. So be aware of this bias for forcing moves and see if you can increase activity, and also the bias for a consistency of plan. So we saw in these cases with Alpha Zero that it was whole board play, like on the queen side and the king side. And that's, you could say, an extension of the principle of two weaknesses. So I hope it was useful for you. I know it's based on Grandmaster games, but I think a lot of those points that we discovered are also applicable to amateur games. And please subscribe, and I hope that you continue to follow my recordings. Thank you. Bye-bye.